Before starting, you can join my Patreon for more spicy and uncensored BL stories. Link is in the channel description.
The easiest person to ignore in the palace archives was the new scribe from the East Wing. He had arrived without ceremony, without references anyone checked too closely, without the kind of scent that made people turn their heads in hallways. The posting had been open for 6 weeks before he applied, a clerical vacancy in the oldest, dustiest section of the East Archive, where documents no one had requested in living memory sat in boxes that no one had opened in decades. The previous scribe had retired without training a replacement. The palace had not bothered to find one until a minor budgetary review flagged the position as technically unfilled. So when Caspian Leith presented himself at the side entrance with a small bag of personal effects and a letter of appointment signed by a mid-level administrator who had never met him, the guard on duty glanced at the document, glanced at Caspian's face, and waved him through without a single question. Unranked read the line in the personnel ledger. That was the only label that mattered. The East Archive smelled like old paper, dust, and the particular stillness of rooms that had been forgotten in the wrong direction. Caspian spent his first 3 days learning the geography of the shelves, not the official catalogue, which was outdated by at least 2 reorganizations, but the actual physical arrangement of documents in the world. He worked slowly, deliberately, the way someone worked when they had no supervisor watching and no deadline pressing. On the 4th day, he found the vent. It was set high in the wall near the southeast corner, where a heating duct from the palace's main system ran along the outer wall before branching into the royal apartments. The grille was old, rusted at the screws, loose enough that a careful hand could tilt the slats without forcing them. Caspian stood beneath it and closed his eyes. The air that drifted through was faint, filtered through layers of stone and insulation and distance, but it carried something he had been tracking for 10 years, and 10 days, and 3 years, all at once. Camphor, ash, medicinal frost. And beneath that, buried so deep that most noses would have missed it entirely, the thin, exhausted thread of a scent that had once been something else. Caspian opened his eyes. He did not smile. He did not whisper anything. He simply tilted the vent slats a fraction of a degree, just enough, and returned to his cataloguing. 12 nights passed. On the first night, Aldric Fenwick took his usual late route through the east corridor, a habit he had developed in the first year of his reign, when the silence of the palace at night was the only silence that did not feel like a threat. He walked past the East Archive window without slowing. On the 3rd night, he slowed. On the 5th night, he stopped. He stood at the window for 11 minutes, staring through the glass at shelves of unread documents, and told himself he was imagining the change in the air. That the vent system was old. That what he smelled was a trick of memory, not a presence. On the 7th night, he stood at the window for 17 minutes. On the 9th night, he did not walk past at all. He stood directly in front of the glass, his breath fogging the cold pane, and he stayed until his shoulders began to shake with the effort of not reaching for the latch. Then he forced himself back to his study, where the suppressant oils sat in their crystal bottle, and he scrubbed his pulse points until the skin turned raw, because he could not afford to feel something that felt like hope. On the 12th night, Aldric stopped at the window and found it unlatched. The glass was open a hair's breadth, not enough for any guard to notice on their rounds, not enough to register as a security breach. Just enough. Just enough for the scent to reach him fully. Snowmelt. Silver tea. Something ancient and patient and devastatingly familiar, drifting through the gap in the window like an invitation he had not known he was waiting for. Aldric's hands stayed at his sides. He counted his own heartbeats. He counted the seconds since he had last felt anything like this. 5 years, 3 months, 11 days, and then, because he was a king and a killer and a man who had trained himself to survive by never reaching for what he wanted, he lifted his hand and pushed the window open. The archive was dark inside, but a single lamp burned at the reading table near the center of the room, and a man sat behind it, a book open in front of him, a cup of tea cooling at his elbow. He did not look surprised. He looked up when Aldric stepped through the window, and his expression held no fear, no fluster, no performative shock. His eyes were gray, the color of winter mornings, and they met Aldric's directly without the calculation of someone who had been caught. He was expecting me, Aldric realized. The thought should have been alarming. It should have been the first sign of a trap, the first reason to turn around, the first confirmation that this was exactly the kind of calculated proximity he had spent 5 years avoiding. But Aldric had spent 5 years alone in a palace full of people, and the man at the reading table was looking at him the way no one had looked at him since before the poison took hold. Not like a threat. Like someone who had been waiting for a very long time, and who was not surprised that the waiting was finally over. Caspian set his book aside. "You're earlier than I expected," he said, and his voice was calm. Not the calm of someone suppressing fear, but the calm of someone who had already decided how this would go. Aldric stayed near the window. His silhouette was sharp in the lamplight, shoulders cut with tension, jaw tight enough to crack stone. "You know me," Aldric said. It was not a question. "I know of you," Caspian replied. "I've been studying your estate records for 3 years. Not the official ones, those are sealed. I've been working with copies, fragments, documents that people forgot to destroy." Aldric's eyes narrowed. "That's a dangerous thing to admit to a king." "I know." Caspian reached for his tea, took a sip, and set the cup down again. "But you came through a window instead of a door, so I suspect we're both doing dangerous things tonight." The silence stretched. Aldric looked at the vent, at the lamp, at the book Caspian had set aside, a volume on archival law, by the look of the spine, dog-eared and annotated in a small, precise hand. "How long?" Aldric asked. "Since I took the post? 12 days. Since you started planning this." Caspian's pause was measured. Precise. 10 years, he said. Aldric's hands went still. 10 years was a number that meant something specific. 10 years ago, Aldric Fenwick had not been king. He had been the second son, the one no one watched, the one whose scent had not yet sharpened into the thing it became. He had walked through the northern market district in civilian clothes, anonymous and untouchable, and he had stopped at a street vendor selling silver tea on a winter morning. A young Omega had been standing at the counter, shivering in a coat too thin for the season, counting coins into his palm with the careful desperation of someone who was deciding between tea and dinner. Aldric had bought him the tea. He had not said anything romantic. He had not expected anything in return. He had simply seen someone cold and purchased warmth for them, the way any decent person might, and then he had walked away and forgotten about it within the hour. The Omega had not forgotten. Aldric had never asked his name, had never seen his face clearly enough to recognize him in a crowd, had assumed, in the way that kings assumed about the people they passed, that the moment had meant nothing to anyone. But the man at the reading table was looking at him with grey winter eyes and a stillness that belonged to things that had learned to wait, and Aldric understood, suddenly, that he had been remembered. "You were in the north," Aldric said slowly. 10 years ago. "Yes." "The market district. The tea vendor." "Yes." Aldric's throat tightened. "I didn't." "I know you didn't." Caspian's voice was gentle, but not soft. "You bought me tea and walked away. It was the first time anyone had ever given me something without wanting something back. I don't expect you to remember it the way I do." The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was heavy, dense, full of the accumulated weight of 10 years and 3 years and 12 days, and Aldric found himself walking toward the reading table without having decided to move. He stopped on the other side of the chair, close enough to feel the warmth of the lamp, close enough to see the exhaustion in Caspian's stillness, not the exhaustion of someone who was tired of waiting, but the exhaustion of someone who had been holding something too heavy for too long. "You called this dangerous," Aldric said. "You don't seem afraid." "I'm not afraid of you." "You should be. I've killed people." "I know." Caspian's gaze did not waver. "I also know that you've tried very hard not to kill anyone since the poison started. That you scrub suppressants into your skin every morning. That you walk past this window every night because it's the only route where you can be sure you won't accidentally brush against someone." Aldric's breath stopped. "How do you know that?" "Observation." Caspian tilted his head slightly. "And research. I told you, I've been studying you for 3 years. Through estate records. Through everything I could find. Estate records were the hardest part. They're sealed in this archive, which is why I needed to be here. But there are letters, journals, administrative notes, traces that people leave behind when they think no one is looking. Aldric's hands were gripping the back of the chair now. His knuckles were white. Why? He asked, and the word came out rough. Caspian looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached into the collar of his shirt and pulled out a thin chain, silver, unadorned, with a small glass vial hanging from the end. The vial was dark, sealed, old. Aldric stared at it. What is that? Caspian's hand closed around the vial. Not protectively, gently. The way someone held something they had been carrying for too long and had never put down. Proof, he said quietly. That what happened to you was not a curse. It was a recipe. The words landed like stone dropped into still water. Aldric did not move. His face did not change. But the air around him shifted. The scent of camphor and ash sharpened, thickened, became something closer to the thing it had been covering for 5 years. A recipe, he repeated. Drummond Cass, head of the Royal Apothecary. He's been dosing you since the week you took the throne. I know. Caspian's eyes widened slightly. It was the first crack in his composure since Aldric had stepped through the window. You know. I've known for 4 years. Aldric's voice was flat, controlled. I just couldn't prove it. The compound is untraceable after 12 hours. No test in the kingdom can detect it. And every apothecary who might have identified it has a standing offer from Drummond, cooperation or disappearance. Caspian stared at him. Then, very slowly, he laughed. It was not a mocking laugh. It was the sound of someone who had been carrying a secret for so long that finding out they were not alone in carrying it felt like a physical release. You knew, Caspian repeated. And you stayed. Where would I go? If I fled the throne, Drummond would install a puppet within the month. If I tried to expose him without evidence, he would have me declared unfit and take control of the crown through regency. I have been sitting on a throne, slowly dying, waiting for someone to bring me what I could not find myself. Caspian's hand was still closed around the vial. Aldric looked at it. The question, he said quietly, is whether you're bringing me the compound, or whether you're bringing me something else. Caspian held his gaze. The compound, he said, in Drummond's own handwriting. From the northern apothecary that burned the same week you took the throne. I found it in the wreckage. Aldric's chest tightened. 3 years ago. 3 years. You've been carrying it for 3 years. Yes. And you came here, to this palace, this archive, this window, to bring it to me. Caspian set the vial on the table. It made a soft sound against the wood, small and final. I came here for you, he said. The vial was the door. The distinction matters. Aldric looked at the vial. Then at Caspian's face. Then at the vial again. It does, he said. It was the first time his voice had softened since he stepped through the window. They sat in the archive until the lamp began to gutter. Aldric asked questions, not about the conspiracy, but about the 3 years Caspian had spent building the case. The documents he had tracked. The witnesses he had interviewed. The estate records he had not been able to access, which would authenticate the vial beyond any challenge. Caspian answered evenly, without hurry. It was the longest conversation Aldric had had with another person in 5 years. When the lamp finally flickered and died, they sat in the dark for a moment, the scent of snow melt and silver tea mixing with the camphor and ash in the space between them. I should go, Aldric said. You should. Neither of them moved. Then Aldric stood. He walked to the window, paused, and looked back over his shoulder. The dark made Caspian's outline uncertain, but Aldric could feel him there. The stillness of him, the patience, the quiet weight of a decade of waiting that had finally reached its destination. Tomorrow night, Aldric said. I'll be here. The window closed behind him. The next night, the window was unlatched before Aldric arrived. He noticed it from 20 paces away, the hairline gap in the frame, the faint warmth from the lamp inside bleeding through the glass. He had not told Caspian what time he would come. He had not told anyone he was coming at all. But the window was open anyway, and the scent drifting through it was not camphor, not ash, not medicinal frost. It was snowmelt and silver tea, waiting for him. Aldric stood in the corridor for a full minute, telling himself he could still turn around. That walking through that window a second time meant something he was not ready to name. That he was a king, and kings did not climb through windows to sit in archives with unranked scribes who carried proof of murder in their pockets. Then he lifted the latch and stepped inside. Caspian was at the same table, but not with a book tonight. A small leather portfolio lay open in front of him, its pages dense with handwriting that Aldric recognized from across the room. His own writing. Letters he had sent in the first year of his reign, before the poison had made his hands shake too badly to hold a pen steadily. Where did you get those? The estate records, Caspian said without looking up. Copies. The originals are sealed in the North Archive, but some of the recipients kept duplicates. I spent 8 months tracking them down. Aldric walked to the table and looked at the open page. It was a letter he had written to his quartermaster, 6 weeks into his reign, asking about the procurement of suppressant oils. The handwriting was steady, confident. A man who had not yet begun to poison himself daily, who still believed he could outlast whatever was killing him. 7 letters total, Caspian said. Spread over your first year. The handwriting degrades in each one. By the last letter, you're writing with your left hand because your right hand can no longer hold a pen steadily enough. I know. The court physicians said it was a hex, a bond curse from a rejected mate. They said the only cure was marriage. They said a lot of things. Caspian finally looked up. His grey eyes were steady, unreadable. But there was something in them that Aldric had not seen the night before. Something harder. Did you believe them? Aldric's jaw tightened. Does it matter? It matters to me. The silence stretched. Aldric looked at the letter, at the degradation of his own handwriting across the months, at the evidence of a man who had been slowly losing control of his own body while the world watched and did nothing. I believed them for the first year, he said finally. I thought it was a hex. I thought I had done something to deserve it. Rejected someone, hurt someone, failed some cosmic test of kingship. I spent that year trying to remember every person I had ever wronged, trying to calculate what I owed, trying to find a way to undo a curse I could not name. And then I noticed that the poisoner who was dosing me did not flinch when I mentioned the curse. He was not afraid of it. A man who has engineered a hex should be afraid of the thing he has created. Drummond was not afraid. Caspian nodded slowly. When did you stop believing it was a curse? Year 2. When I realized that every apothecary who offered me a second opinion died within the month. Caspian set down the portfolio and reached for the vial around his neck. He did not unclasp it this time. He simply held it, the glass warm from his skin, and looked at Aldric with an expression that was hard to read. You've been dying slowly for 5 years, Caspian said. You've known it was murder for 4. You've been sitting on a throne, waiting for someone to bring you the evidence you could not find yourself, and you have not told a single person. No. Why? Aldric's hands were on the back of the chair again, gripping it. The only way he could keep them still. Because if I told someone, they would try to help me. And anyone who tried to help me would die. Drummond has been thorough. He has informants in every department, every wing, every staff rotation. The only reason he has not noticed you yet is that you are unranked, invisible, and assigned to the one section of the archive that no one has touched in 20 years. Caspian's mouth curved, not quite a smile, but close. I know. You knew that when you took the post. Yes. And you took it anyway. Yes. Aldric stared at him. Why? Caspian set the vial down on the table, between them, like a marker he was willing to cross. You bought me tea 10 years ago, he said. You have no idea what that meant to me. But I have spent the decade since trying to become someone worthy of that kindness. I found the vial in the apothecary ruins 3 years ago, and I have spent every day since trying to find a way to bring it to you without getting us both killed before I could prove it. Aldric's hands were shaking. He could not stop them. You do not owe me. I know. Caspian's voice was quiet, but it cut through Aldric's like a blade through silk. I know I don't owe you. This is not about debt. This is about the fact that I saw you dying from a distance and could not live with myself if I did nothing. Aldric's throat closed. He had spent 5 years alone. 5 years telling himself that isolation was protection, that distance was mercy, that the only way to keep people alive was to make sure they never got close enough to be burned. And this man, this quiet, grey-eyed, unranked scribe who had been carrying a vial around his neck for 3 years, had looked at the fire and walked toward it anyway. You should be afraid of me, Aldric said, and his voice was rough. I'm not. I could hurt you. The poison makes my instincts unpredictable. I have gone weeks without sleeping. I have. You have scrub marks on your wrists from the suppressant oils, Caspian said. You have calluses on your palms from gripping the arms of your throne to keep your hands still. You have not touched another person in 5 years because you are terrified of what might happen if you do. Aldric's breath stopped. Caspian looked at him evenly. That is not a man who is dangerous to others. That is a man who is destroying himself to protect everyone else. And I am not afraid of that. The silence that followed was not the silence of a room. It was the silence of a man who had not been seen in 5 years, suddenly realizing that he was standing in front of someone who saw him completely. Aldric did not know what to do with that. He did not know how to be seen. He stood at the edge of the reading table, his hands white-knuckled on the chair back, and he felt something crack inside his chest. Something that had been frozen so long he had forgotten it was there. You cannot stay here, he said finally. Drummond will notice you eventually. I know. When he does, he will move against you. I know. And you are staying anyway. Caspian's grey eyes held his. I told you, he said quietly. I came here for you. The vial was the door, but you are the destination. I have been walking toward this moment for 3 years. I am not going to stop because the poisoner might notice me. Aldric's hands tightened on the chair. You are going to get yourself killed. Possibly. Caspian reached for his tea, took a sip, and set the cup down again. But I would rather die trying to save you than live knowing I did nothing. They talked for hours that night. Not about the conspiracy, not directly, but about everything else. The books on Caspian's shelves. The architecture of the East Wing. The way the light fell through the archive windows at different times of day. Aldric told him about the suppressant ritual, the precise measurements, the way his skin had become raw and scarred from years of scrubbing oils into the same pulse points. Caspian listened without interrupting. When Aldric finally fell silent, his hands still shaking, his voice hoarse from talking more than he had in years, Caspian stood and walked to a small cabinet near the back of the archive. He returned with a jar of salve. It's for burns, he said, setting it on the table. I noticed the marks on your wrists. The suppressant oils are caustic with prolonged use. This will help with the scarring. Aldric stared at the jar. You brought burn salve to an archive. I brought burn salve for you. The words were simple, direct, unadorned. Aldric picked up the jar. It was warm from Caspian's hands. You are, Aldric started, and then stopped. I'm what? I don't know what you are. Aldric's voice was rough. I have not had a conversation that interested me in 5 years. I have not had someone look at me without fear in 5 years. And I have not, he stopped again. Caspian waited. I have not had someone bring me something because they wanted to ease my pain without wanting something in return in 5 years. Caspian's expression softened. Then we're even, he said, because you gave me that 10 years ago, and I have been trying to pay it forward ever since. Dawn was breaking when Aldric finally left. The window had to remain closed during the day, guards patrolled more frequently in daylight hours, and the gap in the frame would be noticed. But Aldric stood at the sill for a long moment, the jar of salve in his hand, looking back at Caspian. Tomorrow night, he said, I'll be here. Stay away from Drummond. If he notices you, I know what to do. Aldric's jaw tightened. He wanted to argue. He wanted to order Caspian to leave the palace, to take the vial and run, to save himself while there was still time. But the look in Caspian's grey eyes told him that such an order would be useless. Caspian had been walking toward this moment for a decade. He was not going to stop now. Aldric stepped through the window, closed it behind him, and walked back to his apartments with the jar of salve burning a hole in his pocket and the scent of snowmelt still clinging to his skin. 3 days later, Vance Lorne made his first report. He was not a significant figure in the palace hierarchy, a mid-level administrator with access to staff records and an eye for irregularities. But Drummond paid him well for information, and Vance had learned over the years that the safest way to profit from a king's slow death was to stay invisible and keep his eyes open. The report was brief. 3 lines, delivered verbally in a corridor where no one was listening. New scribe in the East Archive. Unranked. Appointed 12 days ago. No references verified. The administrator who signed the letter has been transferred to a northern post and cannot be reached for confirmation. Drummond listened without changing expression. 12 days, he repeated. Yes, my lord. And no one noticed him before now. He works in the oldest section of the archive. No one has visited that wing in months. He was invisible. Drummond's eyes narrowed. Invisible. Yes, my lord. Drummond was silent for a long moment. Then he smiled, a thin, cold expression that did not reach his eyes. I don't believe in invisible scribes, he said. That night, Aldric arrived at the archive window to find Caspian already waiting, but something was different. The lamp was dimmer. The portfolio was closed. And Caspian's stillness had a sharpness to it that had not been there before. He knows, Caspian said before Aldric could speak. Aldric's blood went cold. How? His informant. Someone in the administration flagged my appointment. It took 12 days, but that's faster than I expected. Drummond is efficient. Aldric's hands tightened into fists. I told you. I know what you told me. Caspian's voice was steady. But I also knew this would happen. I did not come here expecting to stay invisible forever. Aldric crossed the room in 3 strides, stopping at the edge of the reading table. His scent had darkened, the camphor and ash sharpening into something thinner, more dangerous. Then what was your plan? Once Drummond identified you, what were you going to do? Caspian looked up at him. Authenticate the vial. Access the sealed estate records. Prove the murder in a court that cannot be bought. And if Drummond moves against you before you can do that, then I will have to move faster. Aldric stared at him. The silence between them was taut, electric, full of the accumulated weight of 3 years of preparation and 12 days of proximity and a decade of devotion that had finally reached its breaking point. You are impossible, Aldric said. I know. You are going to get yourself killed. I know. And I cannot. Aldric stopped. His voice cracked. I cannot watch that happen. I have spent 5 years watching everyone who tried to help me die. I cannot watch you die too. Caspian stood. He crossed the distance between them in 3 steps, stopping close enough that Aldric could feel the warmth of him. The steady, patient warmth of a man who had been walking through fire for years and had not yet burned. You will not watch me die, Caspian said quietly. Because I am not planning to die. I am planning to win. Aldric's breath caught. Come with me, Caspian said. Tomorrow night. I know where the sealed estate records are kept. If we access them together, we can authenticate the vial before Drummond can move against us. The records are in the North Archive. Under guard. I know a way in. Aldric's hands were shaking. The scarred, raw skin on his wrists burned with the memory of years of suppression, years of isolation, years of telling himself that distance was the only mercy he could offer. What you are asking for, he said slowly, is a treasonous act. I am asking you to help me prove that your own apothecary has been poisoning you for 5 years. If that is treason, then I am a traitor. Aldric looked at him. The lamplight caught Caspian's grey eyes, illuminating something ancient and patient and utterly unbreakable. Tomorrow night, Aldric said. I'll be here. And after that. Caspian's mouth curved, a small, quiet smile that transformed his face. After that, we see how fast the truth can travel. The North Archive was not a place Aldric had visited since his coronation. It was a separate building connected to the main palace by an underground passage, a stone corridor that had been used for moving sensitive documents without exposing them to weather or prying eyes. The passage had been sealed 5 years ago, when the poison first took hold, on the grounds that the king's security could not be guaranteed in unmonitored spaces. Drummond had recommended the seal. Drummond had also recommended the guards who now patrolled the North Archive's perimeter, the locks that required 3 different keys, and the policy that no one could enter without written authorization from the Royal Apothecary's office. Caspian knew all of this. He had mapped the passage from the East Archive's basement, an older, forgotten entrance that had been bricked over during a renovation 50 years ago and never unsealed. It had taken him 6 days to find it, another 3 to confirm it was still passable, and the last 2 to chip away enough mortar to create a gap large enough to crawl through. "This is not a plan," Aldric said, staring at the hole in the wall. "This is a disaster waiting to happen." "It's both," Caspian said. "The best plans usually are." They stood in the East Archive's basement, a low-ceilinged room thick with dust and the skeletons of old shelving units. The hole was at floor level, hidden behind a cabinet that Caspian had pushed aside. It was narrow, dark, and smelled of stone and age. The passage leads to the North Archive's sub-basement. From there, it's 2 flights up to the sealed records room. The guards patrol the main corridors, not the sub-basement. If we move quietly, we won't be seen. If. Caspian looked at him. The lamplight from the archive above cast a faint glow down the stairs, catching the edges of his face in gold and shadow. "Do you trust me?" The question hung in the air between them. Aldric had not trusted anyone in 5 years. He had built his survival on the foundation of mistrust, on the assumption that every advisor, every servant, every person who approached him had been placed there by Drummond or by someone who answered to Drummond. He had survived by assuming the worst of everyone. But this man had carried a vial around his neck for 3 years, had taken a post in a forgotten archive, had spent 12 nights letting his scent drift through a vent, waiting for a king to notice him. "Yes," Aldric said. The word felt like breaking something he had built to protect himself. Caspian nodded once, then turned and lowered himself through the hole. The passage was narrower than Aldric had expected. They moved single file, Caspian in front, his silhouette barely visible in the dark. The walls brushed against Aldric's shoulders. The floor was uneven, worn stone that had not been walked on in decades. Caspian did not use a light. He moved by memory, by touch, by the same ancient patience that had carried him through 3 years of preparation. Aldric followed, his hands trailing along the wall to keep his balance, his pulse steadying into something that was not quite calm but was no longer panic. "This passage," Aldric said quietly. "How did you find it?" "Old building plans." The East Archive was originally part of the same complex as the North Archive. They were separated during a renovation in the Third Reign, but the connecting passage was never fully demolished. It was sealed and forgotten. "How long did it take you to find the plans?" 8 months. Aldric's chest tightened. 8 months. Before he had taken the post. Before he had even applied for the position. Caspian had been planning this before he set foot in the palace. "You knew you would need this passage before you even applied for the archive's position." "Yes." Aldric stopped. "That's a level of preparation I did not expect." "You gave me 10 years of preparation," Caspian said without turning. "I used them." The passage ended at a stone wall with a rusted iron grate. Caspian pushed against it. The grate groaned, shifted, and swung open on hinges that had not moved in half a century. Beyond it was the North Archive's sub-basement, a low, vaulted room filled with crates and the smell of old paper. They stepped through. The air was colder here. Drier. The kind of cold that settled into bones and stayed there. Caspian moved immediately to the staircase, his footsteps silent on the stone. Aldric followed, matching his silence, his instincts sharpening into the focused alertness of a man who had spent years learning to survive in hostile territory. 2 flights up, they reached a door. It was locked. Caspian reached into his coat and produced a set of thin metal tools. Aldric watched, surprised, as he knelt and began working on the lock with practiced precision. You know how to pick locks. I know how to do a lot of things that unranked scribes are not supposed to know. The lock clicked. Caspian stood, pushed the door open, and stepped into the sealed records room. The room was larger than Aldric had expected. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with bound volumes and document boxes, each labeled with dates and catalog numbers. The air was heavy with the smell of aged paper, leather bindings, and the particular stillness of information that no one had touched in years. Caspian moved to the far wall, where a section of shelving was marked with the royal seal. The estate records from the first year of your reign, he said, including the apothecary procurement logs. He pulled a volume from the shelf, its spine cracked with age, and laid it on a reading table near the wall. Aldric joined him, looking down at the open pages. The handwriting was neat, bureaucratic, the careful, unremarkable script of a man who had spent years making sure his records were impeccable and uninteresting. Drummond's handwriting, procurement logs, ingredients, quantities, dates. Aldric read the entries, his eyes moving faster as the pattern emerged. Every week, a compound in precise measurements. A compound that matched no known remedy, no standard treatment, no approved formula. A compound that was not supposed to exist. He recorded it, Aldric said slowly. Every dose, every ingredient. He wrote it down. It's the poisoner's flaw, Caspian said. They always write it down. They cannot help themselves. The formula is their masterpiece, and a masterpiece must be documented. Aldric looked at the open page, then at Caspian. The vial you carry, does it match? Caspian reached into his collar and unclasped the chain. He set the vial on the open page, next to the procurement entry. I had it analyzed 3 years ago, he said. It's the same compound, the same formulation. The handwriting in the procurement log matches the handwriting on the vial's label. Drummond wrote both. Aldric stared at the evidence. 5 years of slow death. 5 years of scrubbing suppressants into his skin, of gripping his throne to keep his hands still, of watching himself deteriorate while the world watched and did nothing. And here it was. Written down. Documented. Provable. Your estate records are the only documents that can authenticate the vial, Caspian said. The procurement log is enough. Combined with the vial and the degradation in your letters, we have a case that no court can dismiss. Aldric's hands were on the table, shaking. You did this, he said quietly. You found this. You brought it to me. I told you. I came here for you. The silence was interrupted by footsteps. They came from the corridor outside, heavy, measured, the rhythm of a professional guard making rounds. Aldric's body tensed, his instincts sharpening into immediate threat calculation. Caspian did not move. He was still, utterly still, his grey eyes fixed on the door. The footsteps paused. A key turned in the lock. Caspian moved. He grabbed the volume from the table, closed it, and slid it into his coat in a single fluid motion. His other hand closed around the vial, chain disappearing back around his neck, the glass hidden against his chest. The door swung open. A guard stood in the doorway, his hand on his sword. His eyes moved from Aldric to Caspian and back again, recognition flickering across his face. Your Majesty, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Records access after hours requires written authorization from the Royal Apothecary's office. Aldric's expression did not change. He had worn this mask for 5 years, the cold, controlled facade of a king who could not be surprised, could not be threatened, could not be touched. I am the king, Aldric said. I do not require authorization to access my own records. The guard's eyes flickered to Caspian. The scribe does not have clearance. He is with me. The guard's hand did not leave his sword. Protocol requires. Protocol, Aldric said, his voice dropping lower, requires that you address your king with respect. You are speaking to me as though I am a suspect in my own archive. That is a mistake. The guard's jaw tightened. He knew he was out of line. He knew that Aldric could have him removed, disciplined, dismissed. But he also knew that Drummond paid better than the palace, and that Drummond had made it clear that any unauthorized access to the sealed records was to be reported immediately. With respect, Your Majesty, I am required to report any. I am aware of what you are required to report. Aldric stepped forward, closing the distance between them. His scent sharpened, not the camphor and ash that had dominated for years, but something underneath it. Something older. Something that had been suppressed for so long that its sudden emergence made the guard take an involuntary step back. You will leave this room, Aldric said quietly. You will not report what you saw in here to anyone who is not the king. And if I discover that Drummond Cass has been informed of my movements before morning, I will know exactly who told him. The guard's face went pale. He bowed, stepped back, closed the door. The lock clicked behind him. Aldric stood in the silence, his hands shaking, his breath uneven. He had not used his authority like that in years. He had not let his scent bleed through the suppressants in years. Caspian was watching him. You were magnificent, he said quietly. Aldric's laugh was rough, almost pained. I was terrified. That's what made it magnificent. Caspian crossed the room and stopped in front of him. Close enough that Aldric could feel the warmth of his body, the subtle pulse of his scent. Snowmelt and silver tea, steady and patient. The guard will report to Drummond, Caspian said. We have until morning before the game changes completely. I know. We need to authenticate the vial tonight. I know. Caspian's hand lifted, paused, and then settled gently on Aldric's arm. It was the first time anyone had touched him in 5 years. Aldric's breath stopped. His body went rigid, not with fear, but with the overwhelming sensation of contact, of warmth, of another person's hand against his skin. Caspian did not pull away. Come, he said. We have work to do. They returned to the East Archive through the passage, the volume of procurement logs tucked inside Caspian's coat, the vial warm against his chest. The lamp was still burning. The reading table was still spread with Caspian's notes, his books, his careful annotations. Aldric sat down heavily, exhaustion crashing over him. The confrontation in the North Archive had drained something from him. The last reserves of a man who had been holding himself together through sheer will for 5 years. Caspian set the volume on the table and opened it to the relevant pages. Then he removed the vial from around his neck and placed it beside the procurement log. Do you know what this means? Aldric asked quietly. It means you can prove murder. It means you can remove Drummond. It means I can stop dying. Caspian's hands stilled. Yes, he said. It means that. Aldric looked at him. The lamplight caught the grey of Caspian's eyes, the quiet patience in his face, the evidence of a decade of devotion that had finally reached its destination. What happens after? Aldric asked. Caspian met his gaze. That depends on what you want. The words hung between them, weighted with meaning. Aldric did not answer, but he reached across the table, slowly, and placed his hand over Caspian's. The touch was light, brief, a question rather than a claim. Caspian did not pull away. Morning came faster than either of them wanted. The lamp had burned out sometime in the small hours, leaving them in the grey pre-dawn light that filtered through the archive's high windows. Aldric had fallen asleep at the reading table, his head resting on his folded arms, the procurement log open beside him. Caspian had not slept. He had sat across from Aldric, watching the king's face relax into something younger, softer, less guarded. In sleep, Aldric looked like the man he might have been without 5 years of poison and isolation. The second son who had never expected to rule, who had bought tea for a stranger on a winter morning and walked away without a second thought. Caspian had memorized every line of his face. Now, as the first true light of morning touched the window, he reached across the table and touched Aldric's hand. Aldric woke instantly, his body tensing before his eyes opened. The reflex of a man who had learned to expect danger in every moment of unconsciousness. Then he saw Caspian, and the tension eased. How long? Aldric asked, his voice rough with sleep. An hour until the palace fully wakes. Perhaps less before Drummond receives the guard's report. Aldric sat up, rubbing his face. The exhaustion was still there, carved into the lines around his eyes, but something else had joined it. Something that looked almost like hope. The vial, he said. The procurement log. The letters. Do we have enough? Caspian looked at the evidence spread across the table. The vial. The open page of Drummond's handwriting. The portfolio of Aldric's deteriorating letters. We have enough to bring charges. We have enough to call a tribunal. We have enough to prove that the king was systematically poisoned by his own apothecary for 5 years. But Caspian's pause was measured. But tribunals require time. And Drummond will not give us time. The messenger arrived at the East Archive precisely at dawn. He was a palace page, young and nervous, clutching a sealed letter with the royal apothecary's stamp. He knocked twice, entered when Caspian opened the door, and handed over the letter without meeting either of their eyes. From Lord Drummond Cass, he said, delivered to all palace departments. Caspian broke the seal and read. His expression did not change. What does it say? Aldric asked. Caspian handed him the letter. It was brief, official, and devastating. Effective immediately, the East Archive is closed for structural assessment. All personnel are reassigned to the main library pending investigation of a clerical irregularity in the appointment of the current scribe. Access to the East Wing is restricted to authorized security personnel only. Aldric read it twice. His sealing the archive, he said slowly. The evidence is here. His sealing us in with it. His not sealing us in, Caspian said. His sealing us out. He cannot destroy the evidence without admitting it exists, but he can prevent us from accessing it in a formal proceeding. Without access to the original documents, the vial and the letters are circumstantial. Aldric's hands tightened on the letter. How long until the restriction takes effect? By noon. The structural assessment team will arrive this afternoon. They stood in the archive, the room that had become the center of their world over the past 2 weeks, and looked at the shelves of documents that held the truth of 5 years of murder. Then Caspian moved. He began pulling volumes from the shelves, stacking them on the reading table with focused efficiency. What are you doing? We have 4 hours. We take what we can. The procurement log. The quarterly compounding records. The delivery receipts. Everything that connects Drummond to the compound. Aldric stared at him. That's hundreds of documents. Then we'd better start. They worked in silence for 3 hours. Caspian knew the archive's catalog by heart, every section, every date range, every document that could serve as evidence. He moved through the shelves like a man who had been studying the terrain for years, which he had. Aldric followed his directions, pulling volumes, stacking them on the table, his hands steady despite the exhaustion that pulled at his bones. By the 3rd hour, they had assembled a stack of documents that reached Caspian's shoulder. It's enough, Caspian said, his voice hoarse from dust and concentration. It's not everything, but it's enough. Aldric looked at the stack. Then he looked at Caspian, at the dust in his hair, the shadows under his eyes, the quiet, unbreakable determination that had carried him through 3 years of preparation and 12 days of proximity and a lifetime of waiting. You did this, Aldric said. You found the passage. You identified the records. You carried the vial for 3 years. We did this, Caspian corrected. I could not have authenticated the vial without your estate records. I could not have accessed the records without your authority. And I could not have. He stopped. Could not have what? Caspian's grey eyes met his. I could not have done any of this without you being worth the wait. The words landed like a physical blow. Aldric's breath caught. His hands, still holding a volume of compounding records, trembled slightly. I am not, he started. You are. I have been dying for 5 years. I have been isolated, paranoid, useless. You have been surviving. Caspian stepped closer, the stack of documents between them the only barrier. You have been sitting on a throne, slowly dying, refusing to let anyone close enough to be burned, and you have been doing it alone. That is not weakness. That is the most exhausting kind of strength there is. Aldric's throat tightened. I don't. You don't have to say anything. Caspian's voice was quiet. I didn't say that to hear you argue with it. I said it because I needed you to know that I see you. Not the king. Not the poisoned man. Not the danger you think you are. You. Aldric set the volume down. His hands were shaking. I have not been seen in 5 years, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I know. I did not think anyone would ever. I know. Aldric stepped around the stack of documents. He stopped in front of Caspian, close enough that he could feel the warmth of him, could see the faint silver in his grey eyes, could smell the snow melt and silver tea that had been drifting through his window for 2 weeks and had changed everything. I don't know how to do this, Aldric said. I don't know how to let someone close. I don't know how to. You don't have to know. Caspian's hand lifted, paused, and then settled gently against Aldric's chest, directly over his heart. You just have to let me stay. Aldric's breath stopped. He looked down at Caspian's hand, pale against the dark fabric of his coat, and felt the steady warmth of it through the layers of cloth and suppression and years of isolation. What if I hurt you? Aldric whispered. You won't. You don't know that. I know you've been more afraid of hurting me than you've been of dying. That's not the profile of a man who is dangerous to others. Aldric's eyes closed. The hand over his heart did not move. Stay, Aldric said. The word was rough, broken, dragged from somewhere he had not accessed in years. Caspian's hand pressed gently against his chest. I will. They were loading the documents into crates when the knock came. Not the door, the window. 2 sharp raps against the glass, deliberate and unhurried. Aldric turned. A man stood at the East Archive window, silhouetted against the morning light. He was tall, well-dressed, and smiling with the thin, cold precision of someone who had been waiting for this moment. Drummond Cass. He did not enter through the window. He simply stood there, looking through the glass at the crates of documents, at the evidence being packed, at the king and the scribe standing together in a room that was supposed to have been sealed. Then he raised his hand and tapped the glass once more. A gesture that said, I see you. I know what you're doing. The game has changed. And then he walked away. Aldric's hands were fists at his sides. He knows. He's known since the guard's report, Caspian said. That's why he sent the closure order. That was his message. He couldn't stop us from gathering the evidence, but he wanted us to know that he knows. Then we don't have until noon. No. Caspian looked at the crates. We have until he decides to move. They stood in the silence of the archive, surrounded by the evidence of 5 years of murder, and both of them understood that the next move would not be theirs. Drummond moved faster than they expected. Not against Aldric, that would be regicide, too public, too traceable. And not against the archive, that would be destruction of evidence, too obvious, too easy to connect. He moved against the only target he could destroy without consequence. The messenger arrived at the archive within the hour, bearing a second letter. This one directly from Drummond's office, addressed to the head of palace security. The unranked scribe in the East Archive is to be detained for questioning regarding a clerical irregularity in his appointment. By order of the Royal Apothecary's office, pending investigation. Aldric read the letter, and something in him went cold. His detaining you. His removing me from the equation, Caspian said calmly. Without me, the documents cannot be authenticated. Without the documents, the vial is just a vial. Without the vial, you are still a dying king. Aldric's hands were shaking. I will not let him take you. You cannot stop him legally. The appointment was irregular, that's true. The administrator who signed it has been transferred. There is no one to verify that my appointment was legitimate. Drummond is operating within the law. I don't care about the law. Caspian's grey eyes met his. You should. Because the law is the only thing that will hold Drummond accountable. If you act outside the law now, you give him the ammunition he needs to have you declared unfit. And then he wins. Aldric's jaw tightened. What do you suggest? Caspian reached into his collar and pulled out the chain with the vial. He unclasped it and held it out to Aldric. Take this. Aldric stared at it. That's the evidence. The original compound. Drummond's handwriting. Take it. Keep it safe. If I'm detained, you still have the proof. Aldric did not take the vial. I don't want the proof. I want you. Caspian's composure cracked, just slightly, just enough for Aldric to see the fear underneath the calm. I know, Caspian said quietly, but you need the proof more than you need me. If Drummond destroys the vial, the case collapses. The procurement log is important, but it's circumstantial without the compound. The vial is the key. Aldric's hand closed around the vial. It was warm from Caspian's skin. I will get you out. I know. I will tear this palace apart to get you out. I know. Caspian looked at him, a long, steady look that carried the weight of 10 years and 3 years and 12 days and 4 hours, all compressed into a single moment. I came here for you, he said. I am not going to stop because of this. The security detail arrived 10 minutes later. There were 4 of them, uniformed, professional, carrying the authority of the Royal Apothecary's office. They stood in the archive doorway and looked at the king and the scribe standing together among the crates of evidence. The lead guard bowed to Aldric. Your Majesty, we have orders to detain the scribe for questioning. Aldric's expression was cold, controlled, the mask he had worn for 5 years. On what grounds? Clerical irregularity in his appointment, Your Majesty. The matter will be resolved within the week. And if I refuse? The guard's expression did not change. The order comes from the Royal Apothecary's office, Your Majesty. It is a matter of palace procedure, not crown authority. Meaning, the king does not have the power to overrule this order without declaring the apothecary's office to be in conflict with the crown, which would be an act of war against one of his own departments, which would destabilize the entire palace. Drummond had thought of everything. Aldric's hands were fists at his sides. Caspian stepped forward. It's all right, he said quietly. I'll go. Aldric's eyes met his. The vial, Caspian said, his voice low enough that only Aldric could hear. Keep it safe. I'll find a way to reach you. He did not resist as the guards moved forward. They took his arms, not roughly, but firmly. They led him past Aldric, out of the archive, through the doorway that had never been the one he had entered by. At the threshold, Caspian paused. He turned his head, just slightly, and looked back at Aldric. The look lasted only a second. But in that second, Aldric saw something that made his chest ache. Not fear. Not defeat. Trust. Caspian trusted him to finish what they had started. Then the guards pulled him through the doorway, and he was gone. Aldric stood alone in the archive. The crates of documents surrounded him. The evidence of 5 years of murder sat in stacks at his feet. And in his hand, still warm from Caspian's skin, was the vial that could prove it all. He closed his hand around it. And for the first time in 5 years, Aldric Fenwick felt something that was not exhaustion, or pain, or the slow grinding of a death he had accepted. He felt fury. It burned through him, clean and bright, cutting through the suppressants and the poison and the years of isolation like a blade through silk. He did not walk to the door of the archive. He walked to the window, the one that had been left unlatched for him, 13 nights ago, by a man who had been carrying a vial around his neck for 3 years and had not stopped believing. Aldric looked through the glass at the palace beyond. Drummond's palace. Drummond's game. Drummond's rules. Not anymore. The interrogation room was in the apothecary's sublevel. It was not a cell. Drummond was too careful for that. It was a windowless office with a single desk, 2 chairs, and a locked door. The walls were bare. The air smelled of antiseptic and something metallic that Caspian recognized from the northern apothecary ruins. He sat in the chair facing the door, his hands resting on the table, his posture relaxed. He had been waiting 3 hours. He was not tired. He was not afraid. He was, in fact, exactly where he had expected to be when the game reached this stage. Drummond entered at the 4th hour. He closed the door behind him with precise care, crossed the room, and sat in the chair across from Caspian. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, the choreography of a man who wanted to communicate that he had all the time in the world. He was wrong. 3 years, Drummond said. Caspian did not react. You found the vial in the northern apothecary. You spent 3 years building a case. You took an unranked archival post, engineered proximity to the king, and waited for him to notice you. It is an impressive strategy. Thank you. Drummond's eyes narrowed slightly at the lack of fear. You know that I cannot let you leave this room with that information. I assumed. And yet you do not seem concerned. Caspian's grey eyes met his. Because I am not the only one who has the information. Drummond's expression flickered, a fraction of a second, barely visible, and then smoothed again. The vial, he said. Where is it? I gave it to the king. Drummond's hands stilled on the table. That is a problem. It is. You understand that the vial without the procurement records is still circumstantial. The compound can be replicated. The formula can be argued to belong to any number of treatments. The handwriting can be disputed. You're right, Caspian said. The vial alone is not enough. Drummond's smile returned. Then we understand each other. We do. Caspian leaned back in his chair, and something in his stillness shifted. Not alarm. Not resignation. Something closer to readiness. The sealed records from the king's first year include quarterly procurement logs, compounding receipts, and delivery confirmations. All in your handwriting. All documenting the purchase of ingredients that match the compound in the vial. Ingredients that have no approved medical use in the quantities you ordered. Drummond's smile did not waver. You accessed the sealed records. Yes. Without authorization. Yes. That makes the evidence tainted. Any court will rule it inadmissible. Any court, Caspian agreed, unless the king himself requests the records be unsealed and authenticated in his presence. Drummond went still. He won't do that. He already has. The silence between them stretched, sharpened, became the kind of silence that preceded violence. Drummond's expression did not change, but his hands, resting on the table, curled into fists. Aldric walked through the palace with the vial in his pocket and a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. He did not go to his study. He did not go to the throne room. He went to the administrative wing, where the palace's legal records were kept, and he requested an audience with the chief archivist. The archivist was an elderly beater named Harlow, who had served 4 kings and was not impressed by any of them. She looked at the king standing in her doorway, noted the suppressed fury in his posture, and gestured to the chair across from her desk. Sit. Aldric Saturday. The sealed estate records from my first year as king. I need them unsealed and authenticated. Harlow's eyebrows rose. That requires a formal petition, a tribunal, and... There is no time for a tribunal. The man who has been poisoning me for 5 years is currently interrogating the only person who can prove it. Harlow's expression shifted. She had been in the palace long enough to know what was said and what was not said, what was whispered in corridors and what was screamed in private. Drummond Cass. Yes. Your apothecary. Yes. Harlow was silent for a long moment. Then she opened a drawer, pulled out a key ring, and selected an iron key that looked older than the palace itself. The sealed records are authenticated by the presence of the crown and the chief archivist, she said. That is the only legal requirement. The tribunal provision is a later addition, a bureaucratic layer added by people who were more interested in procedure than truth. Aldric stared at her. You will help me. I will help the truth. Harlow stood, her joints creaking. I have watched you die slowly for 5 years, Your Majesty. I have watched everyone around you pretend not to notice. I am too old to pretend anymore. They moved through the underground passage, the same one Caspian had used, but in reverse. Harlow knew it existed. She had been the one who catalogued the original building plans, 60 years ago, and she had never forgotten. The apothecary's sublevel has a maintenance access, she said as they walked. It connects to the lower archive. Drummond does not know it exists. He has only been in the palace for 7 years. Some knowledge cannot be acquired through scheming. Aldric followed her through the narrow stone corridor, the vial heavy in his pocket, the fury still burning in his chest. Where will they take him? He asked. If Drummond is following his usual pattern, the interrogation room in the apothecary's sublevel. It is not on any official map. But you know where it is. Harlow's mouth curved. I know where everything is. Caspian heard the footsteps before the door opened. Not guards. He had memorized the rhythm of guards' footsteps during his first week in the archive. These were lighter, quicker, coming from a direction that should not have been accessible from the sublevel corridor. The wall behind him shifted. A section of stone paneling slid sideways, revealing a narrow passage and 2 figures silhouetted against darkness beyond. Aldric stepped through first. His eyes found Caspian immediately, and something in his expression. Something that had been held tight, controlled, suppressed, released. You're alive. I told you I would be. Aldric crossed the room in 3 strides, his hands rising as if to touch Caspian, then stopping, hovering, uncertain. We don't have much time, Harlow said from the passage entrance. The guards will check on him within the hour. Aldric's hands dropped. The chief archivist has agreed to authenticate the records. We need the procurement log and the compounding receipts. The full set. Caspian was already on his feet. In the East Archive. Crates by the reading table. Drummond sealed the archive. We cannot enter without triggering security protocols. Caspian's gaze shifted to the passage behind Harlow. Then we use the maintenance route. The palace burned that night. Not with fire. With truth. Aldric stood in the legal chamber of the administrative wing, surrounded by crates of documents, while Harlow authenticated each one with the precision of 60 years of experience. The procurement logs. The compounding receipts. The delivery confirmations. Drummond's handwriting on every page. Caspian stood beside him, still wearing the dust of the archive, still bearing the calm of a man who had been walking toward this moment for a decade. You did this, Aldric said quietly. We did this. The authentication took 3 hours. By the time it was complete, dawn was breaking over the palace, and the evidence against Drummond Cass was irrefutable. Drummond was arrested in his own study at 6 in the morning. He did not resist. He did not protest. He looked at the guards, at the warrant bearing the king's signature, at the sealed crates of evidence stacked in the corridor. Then he looked at Caspian. You played a longer game than I expected, he said. I had a better reason. Drummond's expression did not change, but his eyes shifted to Aldric, standing behind Caspian, and something flickered in them. Recognition. Of what he had lost. Of what he had never understood. He was led away without another word. That night, Aldric returned to the East Archive. It was empty now, stripped of its most valuable documents, silent in the lamplight. The window was latched. The vent was still. The room felt hollow, as though something essential had been removed. He stood at the reading table where Caspian had first sat, a book open in front of him, a cup of tea cooling at his elbow. Like he had been waiting for this specific man to come through this specific window for a very long time. The door opened behind him. Caspian stepped through, still wearing the dust and exhaustion of the past 48 hours. He looked at Aldric standing at the table, and something in his posture softened. It's over, Caspian said. It's over. They stood across from each other, the reading table between them, the same lamp burning at the same angle as it had 13 nights ago. You could leave now, Aldric said quietly. You have what you came for. The evidence is authenticated. Drummond is arrested. The case is closed. Caspian's grey eyes held his. I did not come for the case. Aldric's breath caught. You came for me. I came for you. The silence between them was not heavy. It was full of everything that had been building for 10 years and 3 years and 13 nights, full of the weight of carrying a vial around a neck for 3 years, full of the terror and relief of being seen. Caspian stepped around the table. He stopped in front of Aldric, close enough to touch, close enough to feel the warmth of the king's body through the space between them. 10 years ago, you bought me tea, Caspian said. You have no idea what that meant to me. You have no idea what it meant to be seen by someone who did not want anything from me. To be given something without a price attached. Aldric's hands rose, paused, and then settled on Caspian's shoulders. I remember, he said. Caspian's eyes widened. It took me 3 nights, Aldric continued, to place you. The market. The tea. The shivering Omega who smelled like snow melt and silver and something I could not name. I remembered on the 4th night, when the window was unlatched, and you were sitting at this table, and I realized you had been waiting for me. You remembered. I forgot for 10 years. But I remembered. Caspian's composure broke, just slightly, just enough for Aldric to see the tears gathering at the edges of his grey eyes. Then you know, Caspian whispered, that I could not have stopped. That once I knew it was you, once I recognized the scent beneath the poison, I could not have walked away. I know. I would have burned this palace to the ground to reach you. I know. Caspian reached up and pressed his hand against Aldric's chest, directly over his heart. And I would have burned with it, Caspian said, if that was what it took. Aldric's arms closed around him. The embrace was stiff at first. 5 years of no contact, 5 years of avoiding touch, 5 years of believing his skin was a weapon. But Caspian did not flinch, did not pull away. He simply leaned into the embrace, his face pressed against Aldric's shoulder, his body relaxing into the contact like a man who had been waiting for this for a very long time. Aldric held him. And for the first time in 5 years, his hands did not shake. The mating bite happened in the ruins of the burned archive. Not the real ruins. The actual fire had been averted. The silent hounds intercepted before they could reach the shelves. But the archive had been stripped, rearranged, hollowed out by the removal of its most important documents. It looked like a ruin. It felt like a beginning. They stood in the center of the empty room, surrounded by the scent of old paper and smoke and the lingering traces of evidence that had changed everything. Caspian reached up and pulled his collar aside, exposing his gland. The first time anyone gave me something without wanting something back, he said quietly, was you. The last time I want to be given something I have not chosen is now. This time, I am choosing. Aldric's hands were on his waist, trembling. I may still hurt you. You won't. The poison is gone. You stopped taking the suppressants. The compound is fading from your system. The white wolf's passive aura has been bleeding through the vent for 2 weeks. You are healing. Aldric's breath caught. You knew. I've always known. The white wolf knew you the moment you bought me tea. The rest of me just took a decade to catch up. Aldric's hand lifted, shaking, and touched Caspian's neck. The bond gland was warm beneath his fingers. I have never. I know. I have never chosen anyone. I know. Caspian's grey eyes held his, steady and patient and full of a decade of waiting that had finally reached its destination. Then choose now. Aldric leaned in. The bite was slow, gentle, the opposite of violence. Caspian's breath hitched as Aldric's teeth pressed into his skin, broke through, sealed the bond in a moment that felt like the closing of a circle. The pain was brief. Then heat flooded through him, warm and deep, settling into his bones like a pulse syncing with another pulse. Aldric held him through all of it. The archive smelled like old paper and smoke and the first traces of snow melt and silver tea, mingling with the fading scent of camphor and ash. The most honest possible setting. No audience. No ceremony. No single person who needed to be there except each other. Later, hours later, or minutes, or an eternity that neither of them measured. They sat on the floor of the empty archive, their backs against the shelves, their hands tangled together in the space between them. Thank you, Aldric said quietly. Caspian looked at him. For what? For staying. Caspian's fingers tightened around his. I was never going to leave. The archive was rebuilt. Not immediately, it took 3 months for the structural assessment to clear, another 2 for the new shelving to arrive, and a full 6 months before the first document was returned to its proper place. But on a cool autumn evening, when the last crate had been unpacked and the lamp had been lit at the reading table, Caspian Leith walked through the door and found Aldric Fenwick waiting for him. Not at the window. At the table. Where he belonged. The king looked up when Caspian entered, and the scent that filled the room was no longer camphor and ash. It was cedar and warmth and the faintest trace of snowmelt. Their scent now, mixed and inseparable. "The first volume is back," Aldric said. "The procurement log." Harlow insisted it should be the first one catalogued. Caspian crossed the room and sat across from him, the same position they had occupied on that first night, 13 nights into a 12-day plan that had changed everything. "It belongs here," Caspian said. "Evidence belongs where it can be found." Aldric reached across the table and took his hand. "So do you." The white wolf inside Caspian settled, warm and content, against the bond that had finally anchored him to the place he had been walking toward for a decade. He had entered the palace through a side door, unnoticed, carrying a vial around his neck and a hope he had not dared to name. He had let his scent drift through a vent, night after night, trusting that a dying king would recognize what he had been missing. And the dying king had stopped at the window, and stopped again, and on the 4th night, had unlatched it from the inside. The one who stayed was not the one who needed saving. He was the one who had been saving himself, long enough to reach the man who had forgotten how. Thank you for listening.